So thank you to everybody for turning up for this Talmo session. It's great to see so many people here. Thank you very much for taking the time to come along. If I just share my screen for a moment so I can introduce our speakers that we've got today for you. The session that we're going to run today is called Encouraging Online Student Participation, and this is given by Hilary Holmes, Pawley, Katrine Rogers and Claudi Thomas, who are all academics at the Open University. And the four of them have been working in this area for quite a long time. So they've done a number of scholarship projects in this area to look at the best ways which they've evaluated to get people to actually engage in tutorials. And they've run huge numbers of staff development sessions to get people on board with this, some of which I've been to as well. So I know how good the four of them are at talking about this sort of thing. So we're in for a good afternoon. A few housekeeping rules just before we start on that. For those of you that have been to this session before, you'll remember that we run this in a slightly different version of Zoom. So if we can keep the chat window for comments during the session, there'll be various points in the session where the speakers are going to invite you to share ideas. So if you can use the chat window for that, and we'll keep the question and answer window for questions that you'd like the speakers to, both at the end of the questions, both at the end of the session, and I think they'll be answering some of those questions as we go along as well by typing answers in there as well. The last thing is to remind you all that this session is, we hope, actually being recorded. So if anybody is unhappy about that, then either leave and just watch the session through the YouTube video down there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, hand over, I think, to Sue, and I hope everybody really enjoys this session.
Thank you very much, Rachel. Hopefully you can hear me now and you can see my screen being shared. Right, as Rachel said, that we are all academics at the Open University. We work a lot with students in small tutorial groups, but also in larger, more sort of lecture groups. But obviously our key is to get students to participate and to actually interact with each other and with the lecturers. So, so we're going to talk through a few ideas that we've worked on and we've researched and our colleagues have worked on. They're ideas that we use, but obviously you're going to need to think about them and adapt them into your own settings. And at the end of the session, we'll invite you to type some of the things that you've used that have worked into the chat box. I'm going to pass over to Hilary now, who will talk first of all about, sorry, I'm trying to talk and press buttons at the same time, some of the scholarship that we've worked on.
Okay, thank you very much, Sue, and hello everyone. I thought I'd start a little bit with the background to our sort of active interaction in the OU, and we do build activities into all our course materials and encourage tutors to do the same in their sessions. And you're probably aware that there's quite a lot of literature on the importance of activities to, just hang on. Sorry about that. There's quite a lot of literature on that active learning does deepen mathematical understanding, but recently there's also been quite a lot of research on what happens when tutors swap to teaching online, and there's evidence that people tend to adopt a lecturing style with very little student interaction. So we were quite concerned that this was happening. So Katrina, who's looking after the text chat, and Claudi, who's going to speak later, decided to run a very small research project looking at some tutorials, which the tutors did use quite a lot of activities, and to see if we could find out whether students actually participated and what they found the advantages and disadvantages were. And we hope that by doing that, we might get better insight into how these activities worked and hopefully be able to get some new ideas for staff development. So the research methods we used were as follows, just at the bottom of the screen there, quite a lot of tutorial observations and then semi-structured interviews with the students and surveys. And the results from all that was that actually there was high participation rates from the students. That doesn't mean that they were all sharing their results from questions. Some of them didn't, but we were quite surprised at the participants actually enjoying those activities, finding them useful, helpful for both strengthening old skills and also getting new mathematical skills, and also sort of softer aspects such as they really appreciated being able to benchmark against other students and also feeling that they could see that other students were stuck with things, so they weren't alone in feeling that some of this maths was actually quite difficult. Not all of them did participate, and typically if they'd come along to the tutorial and they were behind with the course, or they felt that they couldn't work as quickly as the other students, that it sort of made them less likely to participate. And the other aspect was if people were using an activity where the responses were not anonymous, although a lot of them said that didn't matter, actually it did seem to have some effect. So, and the other place where it would have an effect was actually where they were completely behind with the module material, so really didn't have much idea of what the questions were asking, because as you probably know, we provide all the materials to the students and they're expected to work through that material to a particular timetable. So if you are thinking of introducing some activities into online sessions, these are some of the things that we think are important to consider. And one of the first things is actually, can both the tutors and the students use the technology easily? So you have to think about how are you going to train the students to be able to use it to a state where it's not interfering with sort of the effort they need to spend on the maths, and similarly with the tutors. So you have to think about how easy are those different tools to use and how are you going to train people to use them. So for example, when we first started doing a lot of online tutorials on a new module in 2010, we made sure that there was a bank of materials that tutors could use for online sessions, that they could either use as they were, they could adapt to something they wanted to do, and as well as giving them some resources to use, it also gave them some good ideas of the different ways these tools could be used. Another thing is obviously thinking about the time you need to prepare the resources, because some of them can be quite intensive. So it's a good idea to consider whether you can sort of collaborate with colleagues and use resources collaboratively. And the other thing is, during the session, you want to think carefully about the balance of how much teaching and how many activities you want. So, it might be one session you have quite a lot of activities and another session you don't have quite so many. So, assuming that people are all happy using the technology, the next thing that is important is how do you as the teacher create an environment that actually encourages participation. And one of the things we noticed from the tutorial observations was that the language the tutors used was very encouraging and sort of highlighting when a question was a little bit difficult, or praising people for when they posted the responses, just encouraging everybody to have a go. So trying to get a relaxed atmosphere where the students felt comfortable to participate. And I mentioned earlier about the importance of things being anonymous. I think that really does help for students who are less confident. The other thing that we noticed was that it's really important to allow time both for the students to do the activities, for them to ask questions if they want to do that, and also for the explanations afterwards, particularly if you're explaining misconceptions, and also to include a range of activities to sort of encourage people who are working at different levels to participate. And we'll sort of see a small example of that a little bit later on. And then the final thing to think about is, can all the students actually participate? Some of them, if they've got mobile devices, and depending on which polling tools you're actually using, might not even allow students to interact. But as I said earlier, they might still be doing the activities at home, even though they're not actually sharing the results on the screen. Another important area to consider is if you do have some students with disabilities, they may need extra support. So for example, if they have difficulties using the mouse, it might be important to make sure that there's a text chat available. And finally, some activities are definitely better for smaller groups. So polling is absolutely fine for larger groups, but things like drawing on the whiteboard, you can get into problems with bandwidth and so on if there are a lot of people trying to use it. Okay, I think at this point I'm going to pass back to Sue. And she'll carry on for a bit.
Right, thank you very much, Hilary. Right, so as well as the lecturer, as well as the actual lecture and getting students to interact within that lecture situation, we also need to think about what other forms of interaction the students might normally have as part of the university setup. I think it's quite important to think about the fact that some of the students may not necessarily be friends with other students within their lecture hall, so in their standard lectures, and so they might not actually be chatting to other students on their course if they're not in the lecture situation. And so for our situation, for the Open University, because all of our students are distance learning, then obviously they're not normally seeing the students on a day-to-day basis. And so we need to make sure that we put systems in place to make sure that the students can actually talk to each other and help each other out, and just really communicate about when they're having problems with the maths, and just get a chance to build some form of community within the degree program and begin within the modules groups that we're teaching in. So we do think about how our students can interact before we actually start the formal teaching session, and also how the students are going to be able to interact during the lecture and at the end of the lecture as well, and also looking at ways we can put things in place at different times of the week, and also different ways that students can communicate and interact and build that sense of community within the whole week. So what we tend to do is we don't tend to plan to start teaching immediately. We always wait a little bit, and we always give the students a chance to chat, and we chat to the students as they come in. Brilliant thing to do to get the students to actually break their fear about talking is just to give them a microphone test as they enter, and then you can just chat about how their day's been or whatever. Because our students are all distance learners, one of the things we do is we put on a map quite often so the students can actually mark where they are. We run some welcome tutorials right at the start of most of our modules, and often you'll get students from all over the world joining those tutorials, so we can actually see how far they're on and usually guess where the furthest student is logging in from. Always building times for questions. Either at the start, we quite often ask how they what they want to learn in the lecture or the tutorial, and then obviously we are asking questions and we're pausing at points to make sure that students have time to ask questions all the way through. And then again, yeah, we're thinking about what we can do at other points during the week to make us available to the students, and also to make other students available, able to talk to each other. We have a lot of forums within the Open University where we encourage students to help each other out with problems, but we're always there in the background to make sure that if we need to do any steering or guiding, then we're there as well, and we're there to chat to. And there's a very close link between the student and their own tutor, who works closely with a small group of 20 students, as opposed to the the high level academics, which may be overviewing a course of 1,000, 2,000 students. Right, I'm going to pass back over to Hilary, who's going to talk about some of the methods we use for interacting.
Okay, thank you, Sue. So the first activity I'd like to talk about, polling. I think this is a really excellent place to start if you've not used interactive exercises before, because it's very easy to set up and use, and you can use it for any size group. You've also got some different types of polls that you can use. Multiple choice, where students just have to choose one correct answer. Multiple answer, where they've got several options they can choose as correct, and also the short text, where they can just type in whatever they like. And as we said earlier, quite a lot of the polling tools are anonymous to the students, but for some of them, you as the lecturer can actually see how people are voting. They can also be used in many different ways, so not just for trying to deepen mathematical understanding, but also perhaps to determine the session content if you've got quite a small group and you want to make sure that you're meeting the needs of the students, or to check underlying skills quickly, because that might give you a clue as to how to pace the tutorial. And then there's the more mathematical ones about just getting them to do some maths, try out some new ideas, maybe highlighting misconceptions and talking those through. And then other things like just asking them to identify errors in a piece of maths, or identifying the process, just asking them what step should we try next, and perhaps letting them try them and then seeing which is best. And also quite a lot of tutors at the end of the session use a poll to just recap on the really main ideas from that session. So we're going to look at how you can actually do some polling. Oops. Okay, Sue, have you passed control completely over? Oh, there we are. Thank you. Okay, so there are basically two ways you can do polling. The first way is where you create a poll yourself using one of the polling tools available, such as Mentimeter, and then you, at the point in the presentation where you want the students to do the poll, you can send them a web link and they just need to click on that, complete the poll, and then you will be able to see the results of that poll and share it so that they can see what other people were thinking about that particular question. If you're using something like Zoom or Microsoft Teams, or what the package we use, which is Adobe Connect, you can actually set up the poll within that application. I'm aware that probably lots of you have used polling before, so at this point I'd be really pleased if you could type things into the text chat about which polling system you've used, if there were things that you felt worked particularly well, or any problems, and then we'll get a feel for who's using what and build that into the discussion at the end. So please go ahead and post in the chat. But whilst that, we're going to be just looking at one or two of these polling tools. So one of the big difficulties with polls is that they quite often don't allow you to put mathematical notation into them. But the Microsoft Forms math quiz does allow you to do that. And you can see from this example here, in order to get any mathematical notation in, you can just type it in using this little template by just clicking on the relevant entries, depending on what you want to input. And then when you've done that, if it's a sort of a very common type of problem, the forms will actually suggest some answers for you, and you can, if you like, add those, or you can put your own answers in. One of the other advantages of this is that you can easily put in images as well, And if you want to do more complicated maths than is in the template there, you just need to enter it in LaTeX and it will display it properly. And similarly, when the students are trying to respond to your question, they'll get a little template of symbols up as well. Okay, so if you're using either an application or one of the online polling systems and you can't put maths into the poll, a really effective way we found of getting around that is to put your question and all the options actually into your presentation, and then have the poll just set up as a fairly generic poll, just with A, B, C, D, and possibly don't know if you want to have that as an option as well. And then when you get to that part in the presentation, you just upload the poll and let students vote on it there, and then display the results as before. Actually, within Adobe Connect, we use layouts, and a very easy way of then using the poll is to use your presentation layout when you're going through your presentation, but then to switch to a polling layout which already has the poll there. And then when they've voted, you can just switch back to the presentation layout. So it's very quick and you're not having to bother about finding the poll or resizing it or any of those problems. So you can see this example here. It's quite a simple problem on conics, and if you have a question like which of the following statements are true, and then say to the students, you know, choose one of these statements to look at first, that you know you think will be moderately challenging for you, and then if you manage to do that, go on to the other ones, and then you can have a range of easy and difficult statements actually within the question. So from the little research study we did, some sort of suggestions came out of that. And one of the things was, as I said earlier, about having a bit of variety. So you can have obviously the simple text chat, sorry, the simple just typing in some text, or just one answer or multiple answers. It is quite important when you just talking about the poll to give some idea of how long you're going to allow the students to do it in, and also for you to allow them some quiet thinking time where you're not actually talking, although after a while, you know, you can start encouraging them to vote if they haven't done so already. And it is important, I think, to broadcast the results in quite a lot of situations, not always, but when quite a lot of the students have voted. One of the things we noticed, if there was a very small group and say most of the students had got the question right and only one had got the question wrong, sometimes the tutor actually voted for the wrong answer, since it was all anonymous, so that student didn't feel they were the only one in the group who couldn't understand it. And then it is important to spend quite a lot of time, if there are clearly misconceptions there, to explain or get them to explain why they think one answer is right and wrong. It can be quite difficult to actually get students to ask their own questions, and we do want to encourage them to do that. So it might be that you need to pause a recording if you're making a recording at that point, and just to really encourage them to ask their own questions in case they think, you know, they're not allowed to do it in this situation. Okay, I'm going to pass you back now to Sue.
There you go. Sorry, I was just trying to unmute myself. I hope I have done now. Looking at some other options. There we go, of interaction. We mentioned it earlier. One of the easiest interactions that students can use is just a chat box. Although, as our research has found, it's not very exciting and they're not very keen on using it, but it is the one we do find that the students do use most often. They use it to chat to each other, and quite often, especially if we've got a large body of students in the room, the chat box can kind of wander off in a completely abstract direction, which is why we do quite often, as we have done today, we've got someone else actually manning the chat box for us. So then they can look at any questions that get raised in the chat box and allow the person that's actually giving the talk to carry on talking without having to worry about what's in the chat box. But what happens is if there is a large body of students in the room and the chat box is going at some rate, then we do find that students do struggle to keep up with the speed, and they can feel really overwhelmed, especially if, for example, you do ask students to put something to the chat box and suddenly lots of answers appear at the same time and they're all zooming away, and you can get some students, especially those that are slightly more anxious, going, I haven't even had a chance to think about what the question might be, let alone what the answer is yet. And there's already people that are putting the answer in. Yeah, as we said, the chat box isn't as enjoyable, but it is easy to use. It's also generally not anonymous, and so some students do fear about putting their suggestions and their answers out there, especially when that tutorial is being recorded. It's one thing doing it if it's not being recorded, but having the knowledge that it's going to be there forever can make a lot more students a lot more fearful to actually type a suggestion into a chat box. Other things we do a lot of is we do what we call whiteboard activities, and this is where students draw things onto the whiteboard, obviously quite simply explained. And as a general rule, it means that even the person who's actually hosting the tutorial can't see who's writing on the whiteboard, so it does become very anonymous, and some students can get slightly emboldened by that fact. So you need to make sure you know where the clear button is very carefully. But also, if you've got a lot of students and they're using the whiteboard at the same time, it can get very chaotic and very messy, and it can also take quite a lot of time. But equally, you can address several points at once, so it's quite useful, and the students really do seem to enjoy using it. It's something slightly different. And there's lots of different sorts of activities we use. We do a lot of colour coding. We use a lot of ticks and crosses. We have a lot of true and false boxes that we get students to type onto the screen whether they think a statement is true or false, and highlight mistakes and things like that. Unfortunately, the way this seminar is set up, we can't actually get you to attempt any of these activities because the whiteboard drawing tools are signed off for just participants of the conference. However, they are available to the host to use. Going to look at a very, very simple activity here. We use these simple activities because we quite often talk to non-mathematicians about this. I always find it quite amusing because we gave this talk to the Open University, and one of our ex-vice chancellors, I won't say who, he got the answer to question C wrong, which I find quite amusing, really. Right, so one of the things we can do with these sort of activities is we can ask students to type into chat box what the answer is. So we can say, well, what's your answer to A? Can you follow a simple BIDMAS rule? There's obviously a huge debate about what the rules are. So so that's an easy one to answer, but equally not very exciting. A lot of the systems that we have the options of some emoticon type things, some agreements, disagreements. These are the emoticons that we have for Adobe Connect, which is what we use at the Open University. We quite like the applause and the laughter emoticons, but you know, it's mathematics, so we don't get them that often. But the agrees and disagrees are quite useful. Also, the step away is very useful if the student needs to leave the room for any reason, because we don't tend to use cameras very often. If the student can tell us that they've left, then at least we know that it's not that they're choosing not to participate, it's just that they're not actually there. And also, as Hilary's talked about, we use polling quite a lot, so we can just ask them what the correct answer is. The other things we can use, this is more of the whiteboard actual drawing activities, so we're looking at ticks and crosses here. In Zoom, it is also possible to add ticks and crosses here with an annotate button. Like I said, unfortunately, it's been switched off for participants, but the host could draw if they wanted to, and I think some might be appearing now from our hosts. I don't know if they're going to add anything else, but as you can see, it's slightly unnerving with things suddenly appearing on the screen, and it is also possible you can move them around as well. Oh, let's go back. There we go, we can move them around and things. So, and like I said, it's very useful. The best thing to know is to have this clear button so that you can actually clear them all off. But they still keep on drawing. Right, we're going to get them to stop drawing now, and I'm going to move on. So this is another form of animation that we've got, and this is where simply students can draw lines to link the correct terms together. Again, it can get quite busy when there's lots of students drawing on the board at the same time, and again, it can happen that in certain packages students can actually move each other's signs around, so lines around, so they can get slightly worried when they've put something down and then someone moves it. But it's just enjoyable. It makes sure they're awake and they're actually thinking by doing it, and you can use it to just highlight simple ideas. This is another one of our favorite types of whiteboard activities, mainly because you can do it in a lot of different ways. You can get students to link the equations to the parabolas, or you can get them to write A, B, C, D against the equations to say which one's right, or you can get them to type into the chat box. And that means that you can get a lot of students that are using different devices to participate in the same activity, but in the ways that their technology allows them to, and which is also can help us with some of our more disabled students. If they can't do certain activities, then they can hopefully participate in some way. And also it means that you can use this screen, and dependent on the technology you're using, then it will you can use it in lots of different ways. So hopefully there is some way that you could use with whether you're using Zoom or Teams or anything like that, there's something you could do that would work in your hosting system. Right, I'm going to pass now on to Claudi, who's going to talk about using a camera and recording.
Great, thanks, Sue. So Hilary mentioned how much time it can take to prepare those mathematical resources, and maybe the easiest and most flexible way of getting your maths into an online session is actually by handwriting it. I was going to try and actually demonstrate this, but as this is a strange Zoom room setup, we couldn't get it to work. But in Zoom, in a normal Zoom meeting, it is really easy to switch cameras. So you can have your normal laptop camera, say, pointing at you, and you can set up another second camera to point at either a whiteboard or at a piece of paper. And all you need to do once it's set up is to click on the video button and switch them over, or to use Alt-N. And also in that case, you would want to pin the spotlight on yourself so that the big screen shows what your camera is transferring over. So right, so this is just a screenshot to show examples. I have used this like the top left with just normal writing, and it's been very readable, no problems at all, and Alt-N, that switching over is very, very quick, so it works really well. I don't have a whiteboard at home, so I just used an A4 sheet and pinned it on my daughter's bedroom wall and took a photo, well, a screenshot, just to show that if you had a whiteboard, you could also point the camera at that, and it should also show up quite well. Okay, so this is all quite flexible, and right, just trying to move on the, okay. So the inbuilt camera, you could just use that, of course, if you've got a high resolution one and point it at a wall. That can work, but actually lots of laptops have very low resolution cameras, and it may not point in the right direction. So that's why you might want to try out a second camera, and actually if you have a mobile phone, that's all you may need. So there are lots of applications that you can use for that, such as EpocCam, DroidCam, IVCam, and so on. Be a little bit careful if you go for this. You just need to make sure that you're choosing the right one for your setup. Some only deal with Windows, some only deal with iPhones. So just make sure that you find one that will work for you. So what you need to do is you need to download this application onto your mobile phone, and you also need to download it on your laptop or computer. And then they can talk to each other either by Wi-Fi or through a USB wire. The apps can cost a bit of money, but some are fairly cheap, and you can also use free versions, but then you might get watermarks. And the other thing you will probably want is a phone holder to put your phone in the right position for wherever you want to point it. Okay. So then, right, as I've already mentioned, switching over between cameras is very easy. You can use the video icon at the bottom left of the Zoom screen, for example, or just use the shortcut Alt+N. So that's not a problem. If for some reason the video setup doesn't work or you don't want to use that, you can also use application sharing. In that case, you have to run the app not just on your phone, but also on your laptop or computer. And then you can share that window that is then showing whatever your camera is picking up. That, however, requires extra bandwidth. So that can be a bit clunky. It can also obscure things on your own screen, such as the chat box. So application sharing can be a little bit difficult to run as a host. So it may be better to just use the video option within Zoom or whichever software you're using. So as mentioned earlier, there are two options. You can point the camera at a piece of paper, and I found that it is very readable if you make it about the size of half an A4 with just normal handwriting. It comes across really very well, but you can experiment with Sharpies and who knows what to see how it works for you. Or you can point the camera at a whiteboard, and again, you have to experiment with how far you put it away from that whiteboard to see how readable it is. And ways to experiment, a useful way is to actually try and log into the conferencing software twice. So set yourself up as a host and then log in separately. If you have a second computer, do it on a second computer, or even do it on the same computer, and try and become a participant. And that can just be really useful, not just to test this out and see what the students might see, but also to test things such as polling. So if you've never done any of this before, try and log in twice. Or if the software allows you to demote yourself from host to participant and back again, then you can also get a quick idea of what the students may actually see when you do these things. I really like the first option of pointing the camera at a piece of paper, because if you write out your maths there, you can then scan those notes in later on and send them to the students afterwards. So you've got a record of that. And just a word of warning, always watch out for technical difficulties. With online sessions, these can happen easily with all sorts of issues can occur. So have a plan B. Right, and then moving on to recording. Just a brief word about if you want to record your sessions. We found that our students at the Open University in maths and stats generally want absolutely everything recorded. Though they do like little parts of the session not to be recorded for question and answer. But generally speaking, they want at least parts of the session recorded. And if you record things, then, and attendance at the live event is optional, you have to watch out. You may find that very few students attend live, and that lots of them watch the recording. So if you record, just watch out for data protection, check with your institution what the rules are. You may have to explain to students all sorts of things, such as what the recording will be used for. So it may be used not just for your own students, but also for quality assurance or who knows what, but you will have to tell your students this normally, and how long it will be kept for and who will have access to it. So just make sure you check what the rules are before you publish recordings and before you actually record. And also, usually you need to check at the start of each session whether people agree to be recorded. And the way we deal with that at the Open University generally is to ask students at the start to just remind them that we're about to record, and if they do not wish to be recorded, that they should leave the session and watch the recording later, so that they don't appear in the recording. And really important with recordings is that students want to use those fast. So they need to know how to navigate the recordings. Sometimes it's possible to put bookmarks in recordings. Some people like to split them up and give them different labels. If you just have one long recording, maybe a copy of the slides will help the students navigate to where they want to be. Right, so I will now hand back to Sue. Okay. So you need to
right,
unmute.
that's it. Sorry, I suddenly realised that. I do apologise. Right, so this is just a little slide that I thought I'd share with you. It's the last slide of the session, you'll be pleased to know probably. It's just looking at a little bit of other research I've been doing. We work a lot with optional tutorials, which are where a number of students are invited to various tutorials. In this case, the students that are being invited are up to about the size of the cohort is about 2,000 students. And so the idea we had was to actually try and break it down so we could actually offer tutorials that were at a time that was more acceptable to the students, because we have part-time students mainly. We standardly run tutorials of a weekday evening, and as you can see from the graph, they were still our most popular tutorial. But we also have students that are working quite quickly because maybe they've got more time on their hands, and so we were running tutorials that were maybe in advance of where we expected the students to work on the notes. And also we had some students that were suffering and were maybe had taken on slightly more than they wanted to, or had other life events come up, and so we also ran tutorials that were running behind where we hoped they were. So say we hoped they were on working through unit 6 of our books at that point. That time we would be running, in the same week we would run a tutorial on unit 6, but we'd also run a tutorial on unit 7 and also a tutorial on unit 5 as well. Ran tutorials on Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings, and also during the day when we would traditionally expect our students to be at work. And also running tutorials for special groups of students. In this case, we have students that quite often combine a couple of our different modules together, and so we ran some special interest tutorials for those students as well. And what we found was basically that by offering a lot more options, then we did get more students turning up face-to-face, well, remotely, for these optional tutorials, and also students were choosing to listen to the recordings a lot more. So just an idea to put out there to you, really, on the basis that now, with you planning a lot more remote lectures and remote tutorials, and not being tied quite so much to when you can have classrooms and things, that there's a possibility that you might want to think about having running some optional tutorials and drop-in sessions at different times of the week. And from our research, it shows one of the most popular times for all of our students is a Sunday evening. Apparently they have nothing better to do than come and listen to mathematics. So I want to say thank you very much for listening to us this afternoon. we're going to open it up a bit more, and if you've had any experience of trying to get students to interact within your online tutorials, it'd be really great if you could share that in the chat box now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and while people are sharing in the chat box anything they've had, going to see go over to Katrina and see if there's any questions that came in while we were talking, or if there's any other questions that people want to put in the Q&A session now. We're happy to talk to answer any questions that are out there.
Yeah, we've had
Sue,
a few.
Thank you very much for that. Sorry, I was just going to hand over Katrina and say that I noticed that you've been extremely busy typing lots of answers. So if you want to kind of summarise some of those, I think that would be useful.
Yeah, okay, so we've had a few questions. I'll summarise them. So one was, how do you put the map, you know, technically into your presentation? And there's probably lots of different ways of doing this. But one way is you like Sue and Hilary and Claudia, we've just shared a presentation now, and you'd have a presentation with a picture of a map on it. And then the way Sue showed as well, the participants can then annotate that map, so they can then put a mark where they are or something like that. There was one question asking to expand on pros and cons of polls that are made online rather than within Zoom or Teams or Adobe Connect. I think there's been loads of discussion on that in the chat box. So if anyone's got anything to add, please do, but otherwise take a look at the chat box. And a very interesting comment about polls being used. We've been talking about using them as part of a synchronous lecture, but someone said, what about using them as a pre-recorded lecture? And yeah, really great idea. You could open one up online and leave it open. So Kevin suggested using it as a lead-in to a live lecture, or I guess you could do that and you could have a closing time later on as well. A question about whether you should always have a don't know option in a poll, in a multiple choice poll. So one thing that we find is it's just useful to know where students have got to, because you're sitting there waiting and you don't know how long it's going to take for students to work it out. It always seems to, it feels like ages as the presenter, and it feels like not very long when you're the student trying to work out the answer. So if they can put in the don't know option, then you know that they've, you know, they're not working on it anymore and you can move on. Or you know that you need to explain it a bit better or something like that. But I'm sure there's reasons not to include it as well. And then, yeah, very important point about students with special needs and how to deal with that. And of course, some students will not be comfortable interacting, and we would never put any pressure on anyone to interact. We'd always be very careful, you know, to leave it very much open to the students. We'd encourage them, but to make it perfectly possible not to. And it's always very useful if you know beforehand of any special needs, so that you can discuss with students whether there's anything you can do to make it easier. And here mental health issues are mentioned. So for example, social anxiety, which is an obvious one, but of course there are all sorts of other accessibility issues that can make it difficult for students to participate. So it's worth bearing all sorts of special needs in mind, and of course they may not be declared as well, but I think there's another session on special needs, so we'll probably go into that lots in the next talk.
Chris is running a session next week on accessibility, so
lots to talk about there. And then, yes, does everyone draw on the same whiteboard? Yes, in our experience, that is what we've been doing, which, as mentioned, can cause a bit of chaos, and if there's too many participants. But I think you can limit the number as well, or you can ask for volunteers. That can work quite well, but generally in small groups. And then the use of cameras. So we tend not to use cameras, certainly not everyone having a camera, just because of bandwidth issues. So things can slow down. I mean, just sharing the whiteboard and lots of people annotating the whiteboard at the same time can all slow things down. So if you've got lots of people streaming their picture, that just slows things down even more. But of course, that's different to what Claudi was talking about, where you can use a camera just to show the maths instead of a shared whiteboard. Oh, and then we've got 4 new questions whilst I've been talking. If anyone else wants to jump in whilst I'm reading them. Yeah, go for it.
So Jennifer's asked, what equipment have you found to be critical to online delivery? I think good headset is absolutely critical. My personal favourite is I have an old touchscreen laptop, and I use that a lot to write on whiteboards myself so that I can make the tutorials very fluid, and so they're not all prescripted with PowerPoint, so it doesn't become a death by PowerPoint tutorial. But again, now we've discovered these options that Claudia was talking about earlier with things like I've been using an ePop cam, and I can literally just hold it over a sheet of paper and then write whatever I want to on the sheet of paper, and it has the benefit that it's a lot more reactive than my very old touchscreen laptop, and we have the sheets of paper that we can then send out to students afterwards if they require it. And I would say that's the 2 things that are really useful to me for all of the online tuition I've done, because we don't tend to use cameras because of the bandwidth, and that doesn't matter so much. A second monitor is actually quite good. And also Claudia was talking about the ability to log on a second time, so you can actually see what the students are seeing. So quite often I'll use the 2 monitors and have one as my host view and then one as my student view. Alex was asking actually about the from the slide I put up at the end. He was saying, do you find that the work-life balance is affected, disrupted by offering tutorials both evenings and weekends? And also, once offered, does this become normalised? And are the lectures expected to always be on and available? I think our tutorials are put out, our tutorial schedules are put out a long time in advance, so the students know exactly when the tutorials are going to be. And to be honest, myself personally, I run an evening tutorial, but then that means I will just make sure I'll take time off during the day. And working at home, as we are all as we are all doing mainly at the moment, then this can actually, I find, have as many benefits as it does affect it, because you're working into the evenings, that you can actually take a bit of time off during the day and spend some quality time with your children that are around, or even just nip to the supermarket, really. So I think you have to be very careful to not let it affect your work-life balance. And also, as lecturers and as tutors, we always let the students know when we expect the length of time we'll take to answer emails and things like that. The university has strict guidelines and policies on that, and it's always made clear to the students. What else have we got? Jennifer's asked, do we split students into small groups or pairs to work and use breakout rooms, or do we teach the entire group at once? It really does depend. We have other tutors that use, I have one of my tutors that I work with quite a lot. She uses a lot of small groups and breaks up students into breakout rooms, and she thinks that works very well. I give a range of tutorials. One of the ones I give, I give some revision tutorials at the start of a course, and we're often talking to about 500 students, and we tend to keep those as a whole group, because I think it can actually get quite confusing if you're trying to split up a lot of students into smaller breakout rooms. So we do tend to keep the large numbers almost as a whole, whereas if you're talking sort of 12, 20 students, then actually to break them down into smaller groups and get them to work on their own in breakout rooms can actually help them to communicate together. And it's amazing how many students that will claim they don't have a microphone until they're actually in a smaller group, and they don't think that the lecturer's listening anymore, and then you'll suddenly find that they're talking. So I think it's very different as to the different situations, and some groups one year will work well and they will chat and they will work as small groups, and other years you can try the same activity and it won't work as well, and it's very dependent on the student cohort. Are there any other questions out there, Katrina?
Another one just turned up.
Anyone else want to answer this one? Any advice about doing team-based learning using breakout rooms, channels in Zoom, MS Teams? I think the advice I would offer is to try and keep it simple to start with. And as Claudi says with the camera, always make sure you've got a backup plan in case it doesn't work. And in case the students don't work, we find we do some project work as team-based learning for one of our applied maths courses, and it's very dependent on the makeup of the students within the group. And some of the students work well, and some of the students are very dominated. Some of the groups are dominated by individual students. And so we try to make sure that we think carefully about the groups that we have and try and make sure we've got a good mix of students in the groups, I think is probably the best advice. And if the groups aren't working and the teams aren't working, you can move students around quite easily. But yeah, keep it simple. Remember that all the students aren't going to have the same technologies or the same ability to use the technology. So make sure that all the activities can be done via either text or whiteboards or chatting. And yeah, try it. Does anyone have any? Alex has asked, do you have any experience running live PC lab sessions? I don't have any experience of that. Do you, or Hilary or Claudi? Katrina, do you have any experience?
I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
I think we're a no, I'm afraid, Alex. We don't have any experience running PC lab sessions.
If anyone does, then please type into the chat box.
Yes. And Matthew's asked, do we have any suggestions for trying to pilot things like whether breakout rooms are going to work, whiteboards, etc.? I think we use each other to pilot things quite a lot, don't we? And we do. We run a lot. We have the benefit that because we work with a whole body of associate lecturers and our tutors that run our small tutor groups of 20 students, then we have a lot of opportunities to try things out within the academic confines of ourselves so that we can look foolish without looking foolish in front of the students. But unfortunately, on the day, technology can work and technology couldn't work. And so, yeah, we always make sure we have a backup. I think always make sure there is something. And yeah, try things out between yourselves, group of friends, and just see if it works.
Brilliant, that's great, Sue, thank you. I wondered if either you or Hilary wanted to pick up at all about the suggestions that people have put into the chat in terms of polling. So there's been quite a few good suggestions there about different polling systems. I know Pingu's been mentioned there and various other things. If not, that's fine, because we can save the chat and we'll put that onto the website afterwards.
Yeah, I'm afraid I haven't managed to. I've been relying on Katrina to keep up with the chat. I haven't been looking at the chat at all, so I tend to turn it off when I'm talking. Otherwise, it flickers in the corner of my eye, and it's very off-putting. And trying to click buttons and talk at the same time is quite hard enough, I find.
Okay, great. Well, can I say thanks to the four of you for a really great session. What I'm going to do is to just show people what we've got coming up in the next few weeks and in September as well. But then I think the four of you said that you'd stay around a bit at the end if people had got any more questions. So if I can just tell people what is coming up, and then I'll hand back to you in case people have got anything else that they particularly like to ask you, if that's all right. Okay, so just before people run off, if show people. Okay, so next week we have another afternoon event from 2 till 3, which is going to be given by Chris Hughes, and that's looking at accessibility in maths and stats. I know from the sessions that we ran earlier, there were quite a few questions that came up around accessibility, and it's something that I think all of us are scratching our heads about and worrying about as well. So that's coming up next week. The week after that, we've got an afternoon dedicated to statistics. So rather than having kind of broad session, that's going to be actually dedicated to different statistics and teaching those online. And then we're going to have a break. Hurrah! We're all going to have a break during August and recover and not die before we have to go into the next term. So we're going to start and kick off in September with a workshop over a couple of days like we did before, which is specifically going to be looking at teaching and learning mathematics online. The other thing that I wanted to say is Kevin is amazing, really. Kevin has done an absolutely fantastic job with the website. You know, for somebody who's incredibly busy doing everything else, the speed that he puts things up on the website is something to behold, really. So if you haven't looked at the website, and indeed, even if you have looked at the website, if you look again 10 minutes later, the chances are he's put something else up there. So please do keep going back and having a look at the videos, and we've got short guides and case studies of things coming up as well down there. So do keep an eye on that, and do encourage other people to also sign up as well, because we will keep sending things out about new sessions that we might run and things that we might do down there. So can I just thank Kevin and Michael for hosting this session through the Birmingham site as well. So thank you to both of them, and can I ask everybody to just show their appreciation silently in your own room for all of our speakers as well. So thank you very much.